All right, hey everybody, welcome back. Tonight we're going to talk about terroir and what that means. So we've talked about terroir before in this class, and this presentation is going to be a little more detailed, and it was really interesting reading the chapter in the textbook New Viticulture by Jamie Good about that. He had just lots of good personal interviews with researchers and wineries, winemakers from all over the world. So yeah, check it out if you're interested in that. So terroir, as we've talked about before, is a sense of place in wine. So when you taste a wine, it directly transports you to that area with the climate, the soil, the topography, and also the surrounding plants. So you taste this wine, and it's just a representation of this area in a bottle. So climate could be hot, cold, temperate. This will affect the resulting characteristics of the wine, of course. The soil is going to have a big effect as well. Clay, sand, silt, loam, drainage, nutrients, and the growth of the vines. Then topography, hills, shade, sun exposure, elevation, and the surrounding plants, the flora, native yeast, and bacteria will all affect the aromas that are present in your wine. So that's just kind of like a one slide cliff notes of mostly encompassing terroir. If you want to read more information, I do have a Wine Folly article linked to the slide, which is pretty good. But we're going to kind of break it down into some examples and some more thorough presentation. So part one is climate. So if you look at climate and you do wine tasting, if you are a very experienced wine taster, you'll very well know the concept of cool climate versus hot climate wines. So to put this down into more simple terms, like what's the difference between a Cabernet Sauvignon made in El Dorado versus Monterey? Well, Monterey, let's break it down, is very low elevation. It's basically sea level, right? They have cooler days and less sun exposure because of the marine layer. So all that takes a while for that fog to burn off. The sun comes out. The climate is very much moderated by the ocean and by the big body of water that it is, right? So it keeps temperatures pretty consistent. And they do get sun exposure, and they do make some incredible wines there. But this is going to be very different than grapes that are grown in El Dorado, which is high elevation. We have hot days and cool nights, lots of sun exposure and radiation. So just very, very different wine. So what will be different? Speaking on just a very practical term, the acid and sugar levels will be very different, and this will impact the style and just overall type of wine that it becomes. So in a cooler climate, in this example it's Monterey, grapes will ultimately produce higher natural acids and lower sugars. So they'll actually retain their acids with that cool weather. So a cab that's harvested in Monterey is going to have that higher natural acid that's in that grape is going to be more tart, crisp, kind of like bright flavors. So cranberry, raspberry, tart cherry be very typical. And again, this is very broad generalizations of the difference of the two regions. There's always going to be exceptions to the rule. This is just a stepping stone to help you get started understanding the differences. So they're going to have higher natural acids and lower sugars. So cranberry, raspberry, tart cherry will be typical of that wine. Also, it could be more herbaceous and vegetal because of that, the lower sugar content. And lower sugar also means lower alcohol in those wines too, as compared to a warmer climate. So think El Dorado, with their very warm days and long growing season and lots of sun exposure throughout that growing season. We have more sugar and also lower natural acids in comparison to cooler climates. So with more sugar and less acid, you get more of like the blueberry, blackberry, strawberry, or black cherry component. So think of just less acidic fruits, basically, right? And then also riper fruits, too. And then higher sugar will be less vegetal and less gravelly, but also higher alcohol in those wines, too. And again, these are very broad generalizations. This is just an example for Cabernet Sauvignon. There's always going to be exceptions to this. Here's a nice little graphic that will help you keep it organized and why this is important. So cooler conditions, so being coastal, cool regions, lots of marine layer, fog influence, and lesser sun during the day. So you have less ripeness in fruit, but more tart, bright fruit flavors because of that higher acidity and lower sugar content, Lower sugar content means lower alcohol, and lower alcohol leads to lighter bodied wines. So very nice, crisp, fresh, light wines, very easy drink, very fun, fantastic. Warmer conditions, more ripeness in fruit. So these will be with that less acidity. So they're going to seem softer on the palate, generally speaking. Sweeter fruit flavors or sweeter fruit aromatics. Lower acidity and higher sugar. Higher sugar means higher alcohol, and higher alcohol means fuller body. So in very broad terms, this could be very fruit-forward, jammy, higher alcohol wines. Again, this is very broad generalizations. There's a whole spectrum of wines that each area produces, but this is just a, like I said, first step to start to understand the difference. Then we also have a really cool graphic here from WSET Level 2, and this really nicely kind of displays the different styles of Chardonnay that are produced from different climates. So a Chardonnay that's produced in a cool climate will typically have a high acidity, and then the characters that are associated with that would be green fruit, citrus fruit, and vegetable. So it makes sense. Moderate climates where it's a little bit warmer, you get some citrus fruit, but also some stone fruit and tropical fruit in there as well. In a very hot climate, you'll get tropical fruit like banana, pineapple, peach, mango, and fig. So I think those really, really ripe fruits. So, and that's all just in the same variety Chardonnay. So it just shows you if you like certain styles of wines, it's very important to keep track of what climates and what regions they're grown in, because then that will tell you like a cool climate wine versus the hot climate wine of that wine. So that's kind of where you start on that. So that's kind of the big picture of how climate affects everything and how it is one of the major pieces of terroir, because without the climate being correct, you have no grapes, right, in extreme situations. So part 2 is soil. And to break it down in very simple terms, there's different types of soil. There's clay, silt, and sand. Loam is a combination of those 3 different soil types. And this can affect your vineyard in lots of ways. We talk about soil porosity, the water capacity of your vineyard, how much water can your vines pull from the soil when they're thirsty and they need it. Drainage, we have appropriate drainage, or your roots suffocating in water. Also nutrients, organic material, so nitrogen, potassium, calcium, magnesium. We're going to have a whole presentation just on soil, so we're just going to very basic cover it in this presentation, but this is what you'll need to know. So the different soil types are based off of their porosity, or like the size of it. So coarse sand is the largest, and that goes from 2 to 0.2 millimeters. Then we have fine sand, which is 0.2 to 0.02 millimeters. So if you looked at these under a microscope, these would be like the larger parts of the soil. Then in the middle of that we have silt, which is 20 to 2 micrometers, and then clay, which is less than 2 micrometers. This is very, very, very small. So clay, you would have a very difficult time seeing with the naked eye. You'd need a microscope to see that. And then, as we said before, loam is a combination of sand, silt, and clay. Typically, in a very general senses for gardening, 40 to 20% of those in that combination. This is a soil triangle. So you have the 3 different types of soil: silt, sand, and clay. And then if you are able to discover the percentages that are within the soil around your home, you can find out what type of soil you have. So again, a combination of these things would be loam, but then say you have high sand and you have low clay, but then you also have high silt, then you'd be in here, sandy, clay, loam. So you just follow the percentages that are around this triangle and you could discover what you have. So yeah, and as you can see, a little bit of clay goes a long ways. A lot of this is just clay. So speaking of terroir and soil, it brings up a really interesting question of, do we taste soil? So when we are tasting wines, are we tasting the clay? Are we tasting the salt? Are we tasting, the dustiness of the dry roads or whatever? And the answer to that is no. It's easy to romanticize the wine, but unless winemakers are literally putting dirt into tanks you are not tasting the soil of the wine. So flavor compounds in wine are created by a couple different things, and one is the yeast. The yeast that you choose itself will create flavor compounds, and then there are also flavor precursors that are in the grape itself, and they become synthesized during the process of fermentation. So the yeast will have very specific aromas that it'll want to create itself because of just the subspecies of yeast that it is or where it was isolated. But then they're like the variety, the grape itself, right, has precursors for specific types of aromas and flavors that are typical to that variety. But there are also aromas that are synthesized in the grape and survive fermentation. So good examples of this would be eucalyptol, so eucalyptus from wineries in Australia. The oil from the trees gets on the grapes. It survives through fermentation, through the harvest and all that processing. And then it stays in the wine itself. So if you like eucalyptus, you might like some Australian red wines. And I do. So I do like eucalyptus. A lesser favorable example of this is smoke taint. And this is something that, unfortunately, the local industry has seen a lot of in the past couple of years. So if you have a local wildfire and that smoke passes over the grapes while they're ripening and developing, that smoke actually passes through the skins, and those smoke compounds bind directly to the sugar, and then they become volatile during fermentation, also during the aging process as well. So that is a flavor that was not necessarily wanted by the winemaker, but as affected the location of the vineyard and the things happening externally around it impacted the flavor of the wine. So no, soils do not impart flavor directly into the wine, but they do affect the growth of the vine and the composition of the grapeberry as a result of that. So that's a very confusing phrase, I know, but just think of it as the soil affects the ability for the vine to mature and create balance in sugars and acid, right? But the soil itself is, the vine roots only drink up water and nutrients. They don't drink up apple flavors or orange peel. You can't just go out to the vineyard and bury these things in the soil and hope it's going to, leach into the grapes and then into the wine. It doesn't work like that. So the answer is no. Soils do not directly impart these flavors into the wine. So it gets very confusing. I'm going to say wine. Boop. Okay, next. So what's the deal with dirt, right? So how does the dirt affect the ability for vines to perform? Well, good drainage is very important. It makes the vines develop very deep-set, sturdy roots, resulting in longer-lived vines. Infertile soil that will affect the grapevine because they'll produce less grapes, and the flavors are typically more concentrated or intense as a result of that. If you have fertile soil, it provides healthy fruit and a lot of it. Some of the crop might have to be dropped in order to achieve proper balance. And that's just all something you have to look into for your site. So yeah, soil does play a major part. Part 3 is topography. Topography is a very big one that we look at, especially when we're looking into establishing new vineyards, deciding what soils we do have, and then looking into, okay, what's my orientation of my rows to the sun? What varieties am I going to plant here? And what else is affecting it, right? So airflow, how does the air settle? Do I have like a plot that kind of sits in this bowl where all the cool air flows off of the mountainside and sits at night? Is it a vineyard that's within a canyon? Is there a steady flow of air through that canyon? These are important things because if you have proper airflow within the topography of your vineyard, you're going to be much less likely to have problems with like mold and mildew and stuff like that. It's also very important when you think about the damage that could happen to your vineyard during fire season and smoke. If you live in an area where there's just lots of airflow, it won't impact you as much as areas where the air settles and then just starts marinating those grapes. That's the least ideal situation you could have. But topography is actually one of the reasons that when you look at a grape growing area like the Sierra Foothills and El Dorado AVA, topography is one of the reasons that we produce such a wide selection of grape varieties. We grow over 75, 80 different grape varieties here from all over the world, right? We have grapes from Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, Argentina, and we just can maximize the creativity and what we can do here because of our topography. So because we have hillsides that get, beat by the sun, or we have other parts of the hillsides that receive the gentle morning sun, right? So sun rises in the east and sets in the west. The afternoon sun is much harsher than the morning sun, so choosing varieties that would go well on certain hillsides. We do grow Pinot Noir here in the Sierra foothills at just under 3,000 feet elevation, and that's because, we talked about earlier, we have a nice gentle bowl. All the cool air kind of falls off the backs of the mountain at night, and it cools that bowl of Pinot Noir vines. So we can pull off all these things. So that's all attributed to topography. So other things to think about too is the morning fog and marine layer. So cooler climates often have a marine layer that contribute to that. But then we have some areas in like the Santa Cruz Mountains where they'll plant vineyards above a certain elevation because the marine layer is below that. So those are parts of the mountain that stick above the marine layer, and they can pull that off well. So topography has a very, very large impact. Part 4, surrounding plants and flora. So what grows in your vineyard, right? And anything that grows in your vineyard is going to have an effect on your wine. So a really good example of this is eucalyptus in Australia. We talked about the eucalyptol oils and aromatics that can be found in the wines. Another good example of this is Garrigue in Provence in France. And Garrigue is just an accumulation of all of the dry brush that grows around vineyards in Provence. So we're looking at thyme, basil, sage, lavender, bay leaves, mint, juniper, and more. So this is a combination of plants that grow around the vineyards and then impact the aromatics of the wine from that. And interestingly enough, this is basically the same as the herbs de Provence seasoning that you can buy for cooking. It's a combination of all these wonderful things, and some folks love it. So if you want to go see what that smells like, just go buy some spice. A more recent development that's happening is the concept of Sierra spice in El Dorado, and this is due to the local pine, spruce, and cedar trees in the area. So the theory is that we're getting oils from the trees and aromatics from that. A lot of the El Dorado AVA vineyards are located around, Apple Hill, but also Christmas tree farms as well. So there's this underlying aromatic of kind of Christmas tree or Christmas spices in some of the red wines especially, and also an underlying sense of freshness and vibrancy in the whites. So taste some wines from El Dorado and see if you can get that. It's a new and upcoming theory for the area. It'll be interesting to see if we can prove it with the research paper soon. So something fun. And then smoke taint, as we talked about. So smoke taint would be a surrounding factor that would affect your wines. Are people part of terroir? This is a very interesting concept. So according to Jamie Good in the textbook, here I give a quote here from page 74, the human element of terroir, its expression in the wine is an interpretive act. So ultimately, we can't have terroir without wine, right? You can't just have terroir with grapes. You actually transform those grapes into wine to taste and sense terroir. So there has to be, this is a direct reflection of the relationship between the wine grower and the site. So it's up to the wine grower to understand the site, understand the qualities that it has, and then kind of transform it on this pathway to either amplify or dull those characteristics of the site, right? So we can make decisions on the winemaking side that say, hey, this is a characteristic that this vineyard naturally, displays in the grape, and I really want to showcase that and amplify that. Then I'll make winemaking decisions to do that, or sometimes winemakers will just do what they want to wines and make a style over sense of place, which is a thing too. So very interesting concept put into there. But in addition to that, the winemaker's decisions, winery cleanliness, and the flora that exists from people's decisions create another layer of terroir to be considered as well. And a really good example of this is sherry. So sherry is a type of wine that originates from Jerez in Spain, and sherry is made by taking a white wine and then aging it for a long time with this yeast called flor yeast, Flor. And you can see it here in this barrel. It's this white layer that's on top of this wine. So in a table wine, this is not something you'd want. So sherry wines produce like nutty, caramely, sometimes like butterscotch components. And also these are wines that are oxidized. And that's what the flor yeast is showing. So if you have a white or red wine that has like a white layer of film on it, it's becoming oxidized. But anyways, this is something that is specifically harnessed for the style of sherry wine. And the flor that exists in this winery is highly impacted by the humidity, the temperature, the cellar cleanliness, and the other flora that is or are present there. So the argument here is that there's a terroir in the vineyard, and then it goes through the winemaking process, and then there's also a terroir in the aging process of sherry. So even if you were to take this sherry, the Solera, this age system, right, then you would have to, if you tried to age it in a different cellar, the argument is that it would not be the same because it could be different factors that impact the flavors that are in the wine. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Food for thought. All right. And next we have our lovely learning objectives. So a little bit of a shorter presentation today, but nothing to overwhelm you completely before our first exam. So if you guys have questions, feel free to shoot me an email. And definitely, this did not go over completely everything that was listed in Chapter 5 if you'd like to do some more deep diving into the case studies behind the regions and how they determine terroirs and how they flag off certain parts of the geography and how politics are involved in terroirs sometimes. Definitely look into the chapter. Just keeping it broad and keeping it approachable in this presentation. So anyways, I'll see you guys next time, and thanks for tuning in.